morning to all of you. I am honored to present Archimandrite Cyril Hovorun, who is Professor of Ecclesiology, International Relations and Ecumenism at the University College Stockholm. He is originally from Ukraine, where he first began his studies in theoretical physics before moving to study of theology at the Theological Seminary and Academy in Kyiv. He continued theological education at the National and Cappadocian University of Athens and Durham University in the United Kingdom, where he defended his PhD under the supervision of Professor Father Andrew Love. Father Hovorun taught theology in a number of confessional and public institutions, including theological academies in Kyiv, Moscow, Minsk, National University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kyiv, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, and others. He was a research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities in the United States, a visiting professor at the University of Münster, and international fellow at Chester Running Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada. He has been invited to lecture in over 50 institutions globally, and today he is our guest. I invite him to present his paper called Orthodox Political Theology and Orthodox Discourses Behind the War Against Ukraine. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. I hope I can be heard well. My apologies for being late to join you. Actually, I assumed that we are in the same time zone, and I was wrong. So I really apologize for delaying the conference. And thank you again for the invitation to join you. It's a privilege. I see we are quite a few people here, which is really remarkable. Just another notice, we just finished the sessions of the European Academy of Religion in Bologna, from where I am addressing you, and has been really a fruitful conference, well, a series of plenaries and discussions sessions. Many of them were also dedicated to the war, to Ukraine. It seems to be like an inevitable topic these days. So congratulations and thanks for addressing these topics in your conference. Let me start with some definitions of the political theology. I think that the Orthodox political theology is being increasingly acknowledged as distinct from other theological fields. A growing number of Orthodox theologians from other disciplines, especially patristics, are willing to contribute to it. This contrasts with the earlier generations of theologians who either abstained from it as dangerously political or rejected it as presumably Western and therefore not genuinely Orthodox. It is possible to distinguish two tracks in the modern Orthodox political theology, in my judgment. Those following one of them seek to develop a distinctively Orthodox political theology and make it emphatically confessional, often anti-Western. The other track is more ecumenical and accommodating the ideas borrowed from the West. In contrast to the polemical approach of the former track, the latter one is more in dialogue with the global political theologies. The former conservative and exclusivist track became popular during the 1930s. I would identify the Orthodox political theology that features this kind of exclusivism and conservatism as the theology of the 1930s. This Orthodox political theology of the 1930s echoed similar ideas circulating in other confessional environments of the time, including the one that had produced the famous book by Carl Schmitt, Politische Theologie, published in 1922, It was the 20s, but it really took a spin and became popular in the 30s and reflected the spirit of the 30s. Particularly fruitful was the pro-fascist political theology developed, well, in the interwar Romania. I know it's a very sensitive topic and debatable topic. I know that many in the Romanian Orthodox Church kind of deny the legacy of the interwar theology in Romania. It is not widely acknowledged, but it is certainly acknowledged among the scholars in the civil society in Romania, and it is the discussions are growing. I just here in Bologna, I had some very insightful conversations with some Romanian scholars who write on the interwar political theologies in Romania with some clear pro-fascist clinging. In contrast to Italy, where fascism instrumentalized the church while keeping a considerable distance from it, the Romanian fascist regime wholeheartedly embraced the church with unquestionable reciprocity. A symphonia between the fascist state and the Orthodox Church in Romania became embodied in the one-party dictatorial national legionary state. And you probably know about it much more than I do. The Romanian professor of theology, Nikifor Krajnic, who is becoming quite popular again, I believe, in Romania, right? And his works are increasingly circulated nowadays, criticized republicanism and endorsed one-person rule as more correspondent to the divine order and the traditions of the Romanian people. He envisaged the ideal of an ethnocratic state, in contrast to the democratic state, which, I quote him, is based on the number of population without racial or religious distinction. The ideal Romanian state, according to Krajnic, I quote him again, is the Romanian soil and people. Its principal factors are soil, blood, soul, and faith. The last sentence, this kind of formula, almost like the Chalcedonian formula with 4 definitions, you know, soil, blood, soul, and faith, I believe constitutes the mainstream, constitutes a formula of the mainstream Orthodox political theology during the 1930s. One may conclude that the Orthodox political theology during the 20th century oscillated in coherence with the dominant political ideologies. And I'd like to demonstrate this by the example of a prominent Serbian theologian and even a saint of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Bishop Nikolai Velimirovic. When he was younger, in the 1910s and 1920s, he many times expressed his fascination about democracy. He was quite open-minded and quite kind of pro-democracy thinking person. For example, in the Sermon on Freedom, published in 1918, he argued that Christianity and democracy constitute 2 pillars on which a modern nation should be built. In the 1930s, when the ideological tide changed and it became increasingly conservative to the extent of being fascist and Nazi, Nikolai Velimirovic made a kind of U-turn towards anti-Westernism, nationalism, and anti-liberalism. So he essentially changed together with the mainstream political theology of his time. He embarked on the Serbian ethnic exceptionalism based on upholding strict orthodoxy. Instead of democracy, he began praising theocracy, which he called theodulia. That is to say, slavery to God. It's kind of Serbicized Greek expression. Although Nikolai occasionally criticized some excesses of fascism and Nazism, he went as far as to commend the current German leader, I quote him, meaning, of course, Hitler. And he did this in one of his speeches in 1935. Such panegyrics to Nazis did not help Nikolai to avoid detention in monasteries and the German concentration camps, from which he was liberated by the US troops in the end of the war. He emigrated to the United States, where he again changed his political rhetoric. So the situation changed, the circumstances changed, and Nikolai Velimirovich changed together with them. Now he again praised democracy as the best medicine against tyranny. He thus opened the doors to the post-war Orthodox political theology. This sort of theology demonstrated a strong inclination towards emancipation, openness to the liberating trends in the contemporary societies, and the appropriation of the agenda of social justice. It can be called the theology of aggiornamento. The post-war political theology can be identified as the theology of the 60s. Not because it existed only in this period of time, but because it reflected the emancipatory spirit of this decade. Actually, the 1960s was really a turning point for most churches, particularly the Catholic Church, and we all know how the Vatican II, which took place during half of the decade of the 60s, changed the Catholic Church completely. I just learned a very nice about a very nice image suggested by Giuseppe Alberigo, the famous Italian historian of Vatican II, and he said that if you were somewhere in the universe looking at the Earth as an outsider and looked at the Catholic Church before Vatican II and after Vatican II, you would think that they are two completely different churches. So this was really a big change for the Catholic Church, but also for the Orthodox churches. This theology of the 60s continues to inspire many modern Orthodox thinkers who address various socio-political issues. It is also coherent with similar emancipatory agendas in the Western political theologies, even though it never went as far as in promoting such agendas as the liberation or LGBTQ theologies did in other Christian traditions. The Western political theology in the post-war period was framed by the tragedies of the World War II. Most Orthodox peoples also suffered from this war. Additionally, some of these peoples experienced other tragedies, like the genocides in Turkey, Stalin's purges, as well as famine, mostly in Ukraine, known as Holodomor. However, in contrast to the Western theologians who have produced political theology after Auschwitz, to use the word of Jürgen Moltmann, the Orthodox failed to produce political theologies after genocides, after Gulag, or after Holodomor. Such theological and not just historical reflections are still pending on the agenda of the Orthodox theologians. The ongoing war, Russian war against Ukraine, which is underpinned by the Orthodox political theology in the spirit of the 30s, has created a new momentum for a new anti-totalitarian Orthodox political theology in the spirit of the 60s. So essentially my point, my main point, excuse me, if you want, is that the current tendencies in the Russian church, in the theology, political theology of the Russian church, is just a reincarnation of the political theologies of the 1930s. And in order to neutralize this Russian political theology, we need to go back and to reclaim the legacy of the political theology of the 60s. Let me bring up another illustration to these points. I believe Greece is really a very good illustration, very good case to demonstrate how the Orthodox political theology evolved during the 20th century. Greece has become the epicenter of the post-war Orthodox political theology because of several political circumstances. Well, first of all, it was the only Orthodox country which was relatively free after the World War II. with several periods of dictatorship, like the dictatorship from 1967 through 74. But otherwise, it was more or less democratic, and that's why it was a very interesting laboratory of the evolution of the Orthodox political theology under the free circumstances. A towering representative of the Greek political theology of the 60s, who actually encapsulated the spirit of freedom, was the professor of the Aristotelian University in Thessaloniki, Savas Agouridis, who passed away in 2009. He was a proponent of aggiornamento in the Orthodox Church and its engagement with a modern society as close as possible. His political theology, among other topics, emphasized the value of human rights. He criticized the Orthodox for indifference to this idea of human rights. For him, such interference was a part of the political orthodoxy of the Byzantines, so he called it. He identified this outdated kind of retroversive, close-minded political theology as the one of the Byzantines. Well, probably he just was oversimplified what the Byzantines were, but that was his kind of expression. Agouridis' own political theology aimed at overcoming this kind of orthodoxy, the Byzantine retrogradic theology. In contrast to him, many other theologians before and after the World War II entertained the idea of the revival of Byzantium under the modern socio-political circumstances. And this idea was actually very well expressed, captured by the famous Romanian Byzantinologist Nicolae Iorga, who was also prime minister of Romania in the interwar period. And he published this famous book, Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium, where he thought that we need for the modern kind of circumstances, we need a reincarnation or reincarnations of Byzantium in the modern states. And actually, I believe that it was kind of his inspiration when he was a prime minister of Romania, even for a short time, to build a kind of Byzance in Romania. And of course, it failed, as in many, and as in all other cases. Most dictatorships in the Orthodox countries during the 20th century presented themselves as the incarnations of the Byzantine civilization. And Romania was not an exception, even though like the legionnaire state and even Antonescu later on tried to build a kind of quasi-Byzantine dictatorship, all of them failed. Nevertheless, the references to Byzantium secured for the dictatorships, for the Orthodox dictatorships, and not just the Romanian ones, but we are talking about actually a variety of dictatorships especially in the interwar period, a wide support among the Orthodox population. Monasteries, including the ones on Mount Athos, were particularly keen in offering such support. For example, a leading spiritual figure during the second half of the 20th century, Theoklitos of the Athonite, a famous Gerondas elder, very popular in Greece and elsewhere, praised the leader of the dictatorial regime during the 1967-1974 in Greece, Stylianos Patakos, for mentioning that Greeks have God as our allies. So Patakos said, Greeks have God as our allies. And in the name of God, Patakos actually promoted this dictatorship, and he was absolutely praised by this spiritual leader of the Greek community, Elder Theoklitos. For Theoklitos, this language expresses, I quote Theoklitos, the Helleno-Christian spirit. It also renews memories about the foundations and living experience of our Byzantium. So another reference to Byzantium, another attempt to build Byzance après Byzance. A Greek-American theologian, John Romanidis, tried to substantiate modern Byzantinism more systematically. He developed a theory that the modern Greek identity is reductionist or simply wrong. The true identity of the modern Orthodox Greeks should be Roman, He elaborated on this identity in his writings on Romanes, Romeosini, and my understanding is that the same ideas are very popular in Romania, with the references to the Roman legion in Dacia and this Dacian identity as Roman, as almost like Byzantine or even pre-Byzantine. So the same ideas circulate in different environments. And Romanidis was really outspoken about this. He was right that Romeosini Roman identity, the Roman identity, was basic in Byzantium. However, based on this identity, he built his own version of the Greek civilizational exceptionalism. His political theology that stems from this theory features a strong anti-Westernism and clings to conservative ideology. No surprise, therefore, that Romanidis participated in the political movements that tried to restore the achievements of the junta after its fall in Greece in 1974. I was surprised to learn that Romanidis, even though he was very much interested in kind of a neo-patristic synthesis, he had a very clear political agenda. He even ran for, I think, for a deputy for the party that tried to secure the legacy of the fallen junta in Greece after the junta fell. So figures like Theocritus and Romanidis supported dictatorships out of romantic belief that they are the incarnations of the spirit of Byzantium. Other theologians look at the Orthodox dictators as protectors of the traditional conservative mores or values in the society. Their political theology is often pietistic. Such theologians were associated primarily with the so-called brotherhoods or religious fellowships, lay organizations aiming at re-evangelizing the people, the Greek people. Despite their focus on mission, these organizations never missed an opportunity to engage in political activities, almost exclusively on the conservative or dictatorial side. And I should say that in the period when there was a controversy between the monarchs and the republic in Greece, monarchy and republic in Greece, the brotherhoods completely sided with the monarch side of the controversy. The oldest brotherhood was organized in 1911 under the name of Zoe, meaning life. Until 1938, it was a religious movement without any clear political agenda. In 1938, the Zoe began collaborating with the theological circles that had been formed around the periodical Actines and promoted a conservative socio-political agenda. In the period of the Nazi occupation of Greece, this movement carried out a vision of a new Greece, which would be raised on the values and Christian culture. After the Greek Civil War that followed the World War II, this movement appeared among a few political forces capable of counterweighting the ideological left. Political engagement of Zoe and its departure from its initial educational goal caused a crisis that led to the split of the Brotherhood into two parts, Zoe and Sotir. Sotir meaning savior. Sotir was more liberal. Well, more liberal doesn't mean liberal, because it still kept to the ideological right. The role of the brotherhoods in the Greek church and the society declined after the fall of the dictatorship in 1974. A considerable group of thinkers sprang from them. This group still dominates the scene of the modern Greek political theology. Some of them did not break up with the brotherhoods and others did. The most famous among the latter is Christos Yanaras, who is, I think, well known in Romania, right? And translated widely into the Romanian language. In his younger years, he grew to the senior ranks of the Zoe Brotherhood, and then he slammed the doors behind it, leaving this brotherhood. He has accused the brotherhoods of totalitarian methods and hidden ideological agendas that supported dictatorial tendencies in the Greek society. Being the most remarkable modern political theologian in Greece, Yanaras paradoxically denies that he is a theologian and that an authentic Orthodox political theology can exist at all. His political ideas are spread throughout multiple articles and books, whose volume is quite impressive. There is only one book explicitly dedicated to political theology that he has published. It's titled the chapters of political theology, and published in 1983. This is not a monograph, but a selection of his publications in the Greek newspaper Tobima that follow the fall of the Greek dictatorship. The rejection of dictatorship underpins this volume and his other writings relevant to political theology. Outright anti-Westernism constitutes another key topic of Yanaras's political theology. He condemns political theology as such, as a Western device, which he believes to be completely alien to the Orthodox tradition. An authentic political theology for him should utter prophetic voice, which the Western theology, in his judgment, has lost. The Western political theology for Yanaras reduces the agenda of the political theology as such to the Marxist and neo-Marxist left. It has become nothing more but, I quote him, a surrogate of the disguised neo-leftism, which is neither politics nor theology, end of quote. Yanaras represents a tendency in the Orthodox political theology during the second half of the 20th century to camouflage itself under the guise of demonstratively apolitical theological constructions. So essentially, many political theologians try to present themselves as not political theologians. That was their point. And they were very successful political theologians, in fact, including Yanaras. And including actually Father George Florovsky, who was another seemingly apolitical theologian who produced a very distant political theology under the guise of his project of neo-patristic synthesis. But it's a big topic on its own. This kind of attempt to camouflage the Orthodox political theology for being unpolitical has its explanations. Probably the painful experience of the theology aligning with the totalitarian ideologies in the interwar period made theologians like Yanaras allergic to any political theology. However, they continue thinking along the ideological lines. As a result, they produce what can be called quasi-political theologies. That is, ostensibly apolitical doctrines that feature implicit ideological agendas. Christos Yanaras is not only the most important political theologian of the 60s, but also he is the leader of the exclusivist trend within this group. He believes that the traditional Hellenic civilization, which had its most perfect incarnation in Byzantium, exercised the best sort of political theology. So again, a reference to Byzance après Byzance. He counterposes it to both the Western and Neo-Hellenic societies. The latter suffers from monkeying the Western patterns. Yanaras summarizes his undeclared political theology as a personal, internal rediscovery of Hellenism. It would be incorrect to identify his admiration of Hellenism with nationalism. That would be an oversimplification, of course. He condemns nationalism as a Western device again. And in this point, he's right, I believe. Most ideas and practices that malfunction in the modern Greek society, Yanaras ascribes to the corrupting influence of the West. For example, the Greek junta was nothing else but a fruit of Europe, so he wrote. In examining Hellenic civilization, among others, Yanaras converges with contemporary theologians who came from the right-wing background, such as Panayotis Christou, Father Theodoros Zisis, and others. Pantelis Kalatzidis, a modern Greek thinker, identified them as belonging to the neo-Orthodox movement. This movement enhances orthodoxy as identity, camouflages its conservative ideological preferences under the references to patristics, and is quite anti-ecumenical. A number of Greek theologians have criticized the Greek civilizational exceptionalism. One of them, the mentioned Savas Akouridis, wrote, "Many our compatriots justify the unjustifiable, adopted the theory that we, the Greeks by birth, have in our DNA innate the rights of tolerance. Such a statement is psychological and social illusion, which preserves all the bad things that exist." But Nelis Kalatzidis criticizes the Greek civilization exceptionalism more systematically. His critique addresses what he calls ethno-theology. He stresses a need for eschatology to overcome the present theopolitical schemes that go back to the Byzantine theocracy. Kalaitzidis diagnoses these schemes as incompatible with the original Orthodox tradition. The Orthodox churches, to escape from the trap of exceptionalism and nationalism, need to look not to their past, but to the future, primarily the eschatological future. This will help them to be more relevant in the public square and to promote the cross-centered ethos of Christ with more persuasiveness. This will urge the churches to protest social and institutional evils, including the violation of human dignity and freedom, as well as abuses of others and foreigners. Now let me come to the final part of my presentation and to actually the most urgent topic of our discussion, the situation in the Russian Orthodox Church. It has developed its own vision of civilizational exceptionalism. It has been branded as the Russian world. So the Russian world is a sort of, it's not really a nationalism, it's rather an exceptionalism based on the idea of civilization, which goes beyond, the ethnic borders, ethnic lines. Originally secular and liberal, this concept was appropriated by the Russian Church in the late 2000s and redesigned as conservative and religiously motivated. It is a complex ideological construct that quite fluid. It changes all the time and evolves all the time. And actually, my presentation here at the European Academy of Religion was dedicated to the evolution of the Russian world concept. And I stress that it is liquid. It is really changing all the time. The nationalism of the nationalism of the Russian world is supranational. It goes beyond the nations. It can be called, as I said, civilizational nationalism, as it promotes the Russian civilization as superior to other nations and civilizations. Another element is the so-called traditional values. Another element of this Russian world doctrine. According to the doctrine of the Russian world, the Russian civilization has a special mission from God to protect these values against the moral corruption coming from the West. In some interpretations, this doctrine is presented as dualistic. It renders the imagined West-East divide in effectively ontological terms. From this perspective, Holy Russia embodies the cosmic goodness, which the cosmic evil embodied in the godless West tries to destroy. A Russian priest, Igor Pashmenov, I will quote just only one of them, but actually they speak in one voice. Many people speak in one voice in Russia nowadays. But Pashmenov summarized such a vision in the following statement, which I've translated. He said, "The task of the dark anti-Russian forces is ultimately clear. Through Malorussia, that is Ukraine, which has been enslaved by the satanic religion of the Maidan based on blood," and here he refers to this anti-Jewish blood libel, to overthrow and to destroy our fatherland, to desecrate our holy things and the holy orthodoxy itself. Father Pashmenov has presented such picture to justify the Russian war against Ukraine, which was waged, as we all know, in February 2022. The doctrine of the Russian world, I believe, constitutes the main ideological frame for this war. Russian President Vladimir Putin used some points of this doctrine to justify the war in his address to the Russian public, including the one broadcasted just on the eve of the war. The Kremlin, however, only utilized the doctrine which had been designed by the Russian Orthodox Church. Its main architect is, of course, the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill. He has stressed that I quote him, "The Russian world is a civilizational and not political notion. It is a spiritual, cultural, and value-based dimension of the human personality. This system of values makes Russia different from other countries." End of quote. There are also critics of the Russian world concept within the Russian Church, it should be said. Well, I've been personally criticizing it since 2012 at least. While some apologists of this doctrine present it as having Byzantine roots, I believe it is an updated version of the political theologies of the 1930s that reflected the fascist ideology. That's why, effectively, even though the Russians say that they're fighting the neo-Nazism, but essentially their ideology is quite neo-fascist. After the war in Ukraine started, the awareness about the dangers of the Russian world doctrine became stronger among the Orthodox political theologians. On March 13, 2022, which was the Sunday of Orthodoxy in the Orthodox Church, a group of Orthodox theologians published a declaration on the Russian world, Ruski Mir teaching, which denounced this teaching as a form of Orthodox ethnophilitist, religious fundamentalism, totalitarian in character. From the perspective of the declaration authors, this doctrine is a heresy, which is devastating and dividing the church. Here again in Bologna, we had a special session dedicated to this declaration on the Russian world, where we discussed whether it was really a heresy or it was just another political doctrine. But whatever it is, the Russian world doctrine is really dangerous. It's deadly, and it needs to be addressed. In this session in Bologna, I explained that essentially the formula of this war is guns plus ideas. Guns have been supplied by the Kremlin, the ideas have been supplied by the church and some intellectuals. But essentially the ideas which enabled the guns to shoot and which were enhanced by the military action by the guns, they are not uniquely Russian. They are widely spread in other contexts. The only difference between the ideas of the exceptionalism that Russia now kind of promotes from other exceptionalisms, be they Greek or Romanian or Serbian and so forth, is that the other versions of exceptionalism are not supported by guns. But if imagine there were guns behind them, we would probably have other wars in other countries in other contexts. So it's important to address the ideas, to deconstruct those deadly ideologies in order to essentially to disarm them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this interesting question triggering presentation. Now we still have a few minutes for questions. If you have any questions, please write them into chat, and then I will read it or translate it if I can, and then Cyril will answer them. So Corina asks, I was wondering, probably a rhetorical question, how can this exceptionalism claiming to defend Christian values can be reconciled with the destruction of human life or entire cities?
Well, thank you for this question. It's indeed a good question. And actually, it's not a new approach. I should say that a few days ago, before I was in Bologna, I came to Bologna, I spent some time in Spain, and I visited a city, a medieval city of Avila. It's famous for, of course, for the medieval mystic Teresa of Avila, but also famous for Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition. Actually, the great Inquisitor, Thomas de Torquemada, was buried actually in Avila in the St. Thomas monastery. Well, his body has not survived because the bones were dug out in the 19th century and burned, just as he burned, Jews and other and heretics. But essentially, Thomas de Torquemada believed that the human life is less, and the physical kind of material side of the human life and civilization is less valuable than the spiritual one. In this point, he was probably right, but this gave him an excuse to destroy human life and and civilizations in the name of faith, in the name of survival of the spiritual kind of dimension of the human being. This approach has been famously described by Fyodor Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov in his image of the Great Inquisitor. Actually, he meant exactly Thomas de Torquemada. And of course, Dostoevsky used this image to accuse the West of being inquisiting, of being intolerant to human life. But it appears that the modern Russian civilization is much more correspondent to this description of Dostoevsky. And I believe personally that Dostoevsky is to a great extent a forerunner of this attitude, even though he condemned the Great Inquisitor's kind of approach. And essentially, this is the approach of the Spanish Inquisition, medieval Inquisition, that the Russians practice. They destroy human life. They justify, even the church justifies, violence and destruction in the name of some kind of superior goal, which is the salvation of. They don't speak in the terms of the salvation of the soul. They speak in the salvation of the kind of common soul of this civilization, the Russian civilization, and they are ready to actually sacrifice the entire world for the sake. Remember the words of Putin when he said, "The world is not worthy if Russia is not there, if Russia doesn't exist in this world." And that's why I think they're quite serious when they threaten the world with nuclear weapons, because they say, well, the nuclear weapons destroy the material part of the world, but they will they will save the spirit, the soul, of Russia or of the world, whatever. So it's really a dangerous ideology, but it is not a new one.
Okay, thank you. Then Ludmila Filipovich asked, what doctrines, in your opinion, are able to oppose the doctrine of the Russian measure?
Yes, yes, indeed, the Russian world has this doctrine needs to be destroyed. And actually, the proponents, the propagandists of the Russian doctrine themselves have identified the opposite doctrines. Excuse me, there is some kind of alarm which is disturbing. For example, now the mainstream ideologist of the Russian Church, Alexander Shipkov, who has the official, quite a few official titles, like he's the vice rector of the John the Theologian University in Moscow, and he's the vice deputy chair of the Russian Committee of the Russian Church for media and society. He identified, for example, the theology of Maidan, the Ukrainian-born theology of the Maidan, as the opposite to the Russian world ideology. Therefore, I personally believe that the principles expressed in the theology of the Maidan in Ukraine could be really a worthy and effective counterweight to this exclusivist and quite anti-human ideology of the Russian world.
Thank you again. Now I will read response. I think it was it is connected to your first answer. Jose M. Cabedis wrote, great response, but do not forget that Mr. Torquemada, the great inquisitor, lived in the 15th century. Thanks God we have evolved in the last 5 centuries.
Well, that's exactly. Thanks God we are not in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
But some people try to bring back the Middle Ages to our time.
That's true. And now we take our last question. Tetiana Kaletnichenko wrote, what is the key theological point could be a transformative for Russian world concept? How it could start in ideal world?
Well, I think it should start with the deconstruction. And I believe the European tradition, well, at least there is some use of this post-structuralist philosophical theories like Derrida and others. They can be used exactly to deconstruct the ideological schemes of the Russian world. And of course, they need to be not just deconstructed, but something new needs to be constructed on the basis of this Russian world ideology. I don't have a ready kind of concept for that, and I think it should be done collectively through the common effort of the Orthodox theologians. Now the Orthodox theologians really need to come together and to address this exceptionalist theology, and address it not just for the Russian case, for the sake of the Russian case, but also to revisit the inventory of the old ideologies, including this ideology, the interwar ideology of in Romania or in Serbia or in Bulgaria or in Greece, which were really shameful, I believe. It's time to revisit and to kind of to address those ideologies and to produce instead a new political theology for our time, for the period after this war, as the West had produced a new political theology for the Western world after the World War II.
Thank you again for your presentation. Thank you for the questions and the answers.